Tonight's America's Public Forum is an opportunity to learn from two scholars who have recently published a book called Hope for Democracy: How Citizens Can Bring Reason Back into Politics. John Gastil and Katherine Knobloch are two people who have spent a long time looking at the ways in which citizens, through the Citizens Initiative review process, can have a say in helping others be informed and understand the complexity of what might otherwise be a 30-second clip on television or something they read about in the paper. Ballot initiatives may not seem like the most political of issues, but they are some that have wide reaching implications on people's lives and on their communities and even on their state. Hope for Democracy is a volume that is not just full of information about the Citizens Initiative Review, but it's also told in a way that's really accessible and makes a lot of sense. And I would encourage all of the participants tonight to really be thinking about, what does this mean for me, even if I'm not going to be part of some large-scale deliberative democracy effort such as the CIR. So this evening we're going to hear about this project, but I want to just say briefly here a little bit about these two scholars. John Gastil is a distinguished professor at Penn State University, has written a number of books looking at group communication, politics, and democracy. Catherine, Katie Knobloch, is an assistant professor at Colorado State University, who's also the associate director of the Center for Public Deliberation there, as well as a scholar for on a number of articles that really explores in great detail this question of, how do citizens deliberate, and what does it take to actually do that in a way that is adequately robust. So this evening is an opportunity to be introduced to something that may be really radically new to you, whether it's the CIR or even this idea of deliberative democracy. But my assumption is, from what I know about this book and having read it and learned a great deal about it, is that there is hope for democracy. There is something for us to take away from this. Not just as that's interesting out there for politicians to do, but for us to think about, what does this mean at maybe even a local scale? What does it mean for a school board, for example, or some other issue or initiative that we're making some public decisions about that might benefit through a more deliberative process? So with that, I'm introducing tonight John Gastil and Katie Knobloch.
With y'all. Okay. So thanks for that introduction, Tim, and thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your day and for being on this call tonight. I know that many of us are feeling worried right now. We are worried about our health, our economy, our environment. We're worried about racial injustice. And I think for those of you who on this call who I know take civic life seriously, under all of that worry lies a deep fear about the strength of our democratic institutions. We feel increasingly polarized and alienated from our government and from one another, and it feels like the cries of the public are often unheard by people in power. Perpetual propaganda machines further divide us and blur the lines between fact and fiction. Those fears are real and legitimate, and I share them with many of you. But I also know that there's hope. If we work together, if we are open to improving our institutions, if we focus on listening to the voice of the public, we can find a path forward for democracy. Today, we're going to tell you one story that is chock full of hope. This is the story of the Citizens Initiative Review, a deliberative governing institution built and enacted by ordinary citizens. Though it won't alleviate all of the ailments of our modern democracy, it might be able to offer a little bit of hope for those of you looking for a light at the end of the tunnel. Today, we're going to talk about how the CIR became a governing institution and what we've learned about it in its decade of existence and where it stands now. At its heart, the CIR is a story about people. Some are well connected and some are new to politics. It's the story about how those people work together to change their own political outlooks and the opportunities for the wider public. But it's also about institutional change and the way that deliberative processes learn from, or democratic processes learn from and build on one another. And we're going to start our story tonight with Ned Crosby and Pat Ben. Like many of you, this is Ned and this is Pat. Like many of you, Ned has always been interested in improving the conversation. And starting in the 1970s, he and his wife, Pat, developed citizens' juries that would bring together a small cross-section of voters to discuss public issues and provide recommendations for elected officials based on those discussions. Ned and Pat continue that work to this day through the Jefferson Center, which has hosted citizens' juries around the world that ask everyday citizens to learn about and weigh in on complex issues. Unfortunately, however, citizens' juries are often disconnected from actual decision making. Thankfully, my colleague John, who you'll hear from soon, had a great idea. Why not connect them to ballot measures? Ballot measures are otherwise known as initiative and referenda, and they're laws that the public vote on. They regularly ask members of the public to decide on bills ranging from building a new monorail to labeling genetically modified foods. Rarely, however, do we actually have the information that we need to make those decisions. Instead, we rely on expensive ad campaigns funded by interest groups who have little to no incentive to provide us with fair and reliable information. Instead, they tend to tell us whatever they need to win the election. Recognizing these problems, John saw citizens' juries as a potential solution. If the jurors could review one of the initiatives and then provide their recommendation to voters, they had the chance to actually influence the decision that ultimately got made. And thus the CIR was conceptualized. Although John and Ned attempted to implement that new model in Washington State, where they were at the time, it didn't quite pan out. Thankfully, two friends from graduate school, Tyrone Reitman right here and Elliot Shuford, heard about the idea. Filled with the optimism of youth, they contacted Ned and Pat to see if they'd be willing to support their efforts at introducing a citizens initiative review in Oregon. Ned and Pat were, and the four began to develop an organization to bring the CIR to life. It's now called Healthy Democracy, and Robin Teeter from Healthy Democracy is on this call right now. Hi, Robin. They spent the next few years gathering public and political support and drafting detailed plans for process design. After running some pilots in 2008, the CIR was ready for its first initial test run in the summer of 2010. Now I'm going to introduce you to a new character, a new person. This is Marion Sharp. Marion was one of the first Oregonians to participate in the CIR. During the CIR, Marion and her fellow participants would be studying Measure 73, which was a mandatory minimum sentencing law that was designed to increase jail time for repeat drunk drivers and felony sex offenders. The participants' job at the CIR was to learn as much as they could about the measure, its purpose, and its potential impact, and then to write a statement that passed that information along to voters. Because the CIR is modeled after citizens' juries that Ned invented originally, it shares many of their distinguishing characteristics. So between 20 and 24 citizens gather for about 4 to 5 days to study a ballot measure. Participants hear from advocates in favor of and in opposition to the measure, as well as experts who can speak to questions about its potential impact. At the end of the review, they write a statement for the voters to use in casting their ballots. And that statement contains key facts that the panelists think that voters should know when making their own electoral decisions, as well as the strongest arguments in favor of and in opposition to the measure. During their time together, Marion and her fellow panelists were taught to follow a few ground rules for discussion. So they should listen with care, stay focused on the issue at hand, be diligent in their analysis of the measure, and stay in learning mode until the very end. As the participants began learning about the measure, Marion had more questions than answers, but as the week wore on, she and her fellow panelists began to understand the nuances of the measure that was before them. So although mandatory minimum sentencing can decrease crime because offenders are in jail for longer, it doesn't actually act as a deterrent for future crime, so a nuanced position. The costs would be enormous, and as written, the law could send minors to jail for 25 years for relatively minor infractions. By the end of the week, opponents to the measure outnumbered proponents 21-3, and the panelists wrote a pretty scathing review of the measure. But the question is, did the CIR process work, right? So ideally, these folks come together to learn about an issue and then make a better decision as a result of their deliberations together. One way that we try to answer this question is by examining their vote choice. So prior to deliberation, the measure, it was pretty popular among the public. And you can see that most of the panelists at the CIR, regardless of their political affiliation, said that they were undecided on the measure. After the deliberation, however, we see major shifts. almost all of the panelists, regardless of their political affiliation, shifted towards opposition. This next slide is going to show that in a little bit more detail. This chart is something that we use to talk about how people align ideologically. So the upper right quadrant over here, actually that's the upper left quadrant over here, is where Republicans tend to fall, and down here is where we tend to see liberals or Democrats. The X's here represent those folks who ended up in opposition to the measure, and the check marks represent those people who ended up supporting the measure. As you can see, there isn't really a clear connection between where someone falls on the political ideology scale and their final vote. And that's in part because it was just a badly written law. So there was bipartisan, there was opposition to the measure across political ideologies. Dramatic shifts like that, however, don't need to be the norm for this type of democracy to work. After all, not all laws are terribly written or have drastic unintended consequences. Instead, some ask us to make values decisions, particularly when evidence supports both sides of an argument. That was the case for the second Citizens Initiative review that was run that year. The next week, after Marion and her fellow panelists left, a new group of panelists met to discuss a different measure, and this one was related to medical marijuana. They had their own ups and downs, but at the end of the week, they created a successful statement to share with voters. Their participants' final positions correlated relatively well with their final positions. So those who lean more conservative, those guys up here, ended up opposing medicinal marijuana, where those who were more liberal ended up supporting the medicinal marijuana measure. In this case, the CIR might have actually helped strengthen the ties between individuals' values and their final vote choice, as participants better understood what was at stake in the measure and in the election. After these successful test runs, Healthy Democracy staff spent the next year lobbying the state legislature to permanently implement the CIR. Marion and her fellow panelists spoke on behalf of the CIR to the legislature, and though professional advocacy organizations and some Republicans offered initial resistance, the bill ultimately passed with bipartisan support and cemented the CIR into Oregon's electoral process. The bill also set up a state commission to oversee the CIR that was composed of former panelists and moderators, as well as political appointees. Marion right here was one of the first participant commissioners, and that commission decides what measures the CIR panelists review, and they can make changes to the way that the CIR is structured and conducted. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now so that I can just talk to you a little bit. In a few minutes, John's going to talk more specifically about just how effective the CIR is at improving the public's capacity for decision making. But I want to focus first on how it impacts the way that we think about our role in civic life. We've conducted several studies of CIR participants and of the wider public, and a few key takeaways demonstrate this type of process's capacity to shift the way that we think about government and our relationship to collective governance. And I'm going to focus specifically on the participants. So how does an experience like the CIR influence people like Marion? Well, in my communications with her over the past decade, she's told me that this is one of the most formative experiences of her life. After all, she went from an ordinary citizen to a state commissioner. But do those results hold up for people who don't have the same extended opportunities? The short answer is yes. We find that individuals who attend events like this are more likely to believe themselves capable of self-governance and to think that they have the potential to influence government decisions. The one place where we don't actually see that increase in democratic faith is on a question that asks whether citizens think they can influence government, no matter who is in office. On that question, we actually see a slight loss in faith. This shows us that though people increase their faith in the public, they increase in their faith to influence democracy, they don't necessarily increase their belief or their faith in politicians. And I'm reminded of those findings almost any time I talk to someone who has participated in a deliberative process. In those conversations, people are often shocked that they are capable of having good political conversations across difference, and almost always follow that up with feelings of regret that elected officials don't seem to be able to do the same. We also find that people who participate in deliberative events or processes like the CIR become more involved in civic life. They're more likely to talk about politics and participate locally after their experiences. So for example, participants have formed or joined local organizations focused on education, or report simply being more likely to talk to their neighbor about politics or to contact an elected official if they think there's a problem. One former participant was actually a city councilor himself, and he told me that he took his CIR discussion guidelines back to his local meetings repeatedly reminding his fellow counselors to stay in learning mode when they were engaged in their own deliberations. Even with these changes, however, participants weren't necessarily more likely to participate in traditional politics. So they aren't more likely to join a political party or to attend political rallies. Again, we see a shift in the way that they understand their role in democratic life and in the ways they engage their community, but not necessarily in their faith in what I call strategic political actors. So lots of studies conducted outside of the CIR back these findings up. The results are going to vary based on the context and what type of deliberation people engage in. Deliberative participation often makes people feel more confident and self-governant and more willing to engage in the future. It's also important to note, and I'm sure John will talk more about this, that the CIR is only one example of the deliberative innovations that have been developed over the past several decades. Processes like the CIR are being conducted on the big and small scale all across the world. I do some of that work myself at the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University, where we ask local residents to take part in the development of public policy. Those who participate, whether locally or globally, seem to want more. We tell the larger story of deliberative democracy in the book, where the CIR is positioned as one of many experiments designed to empower the public and bring them more agency in public decision making. For now, however, we're going to return to the CIR. So people like Marion experienced drastic changes in their understanding of an issue and in the ways they engage in public life. But we also wanted to know if those results would hold up for the wider public and how it influenced their votes. So for that, I will turn it over to John.
Thanks, Katie. And howdy, folks. It's a real treat to be here with you and sharing what we're learning. As Katie said, she really focused her remarks on what the Citizens Initiative Review meant for the people who participated on it, right? The actual review panelists, as they're sometimes called. And our research project had two big questions. One is, what is the experience for the individual panelists? Are they actually producing a high quality deliberation? Is it transformative for them? But then as Katie set up, I'm gonna address the larger public. Now, not coincidentally, these small bodies like the Citizens Initiative Review or just CIR, they're sometimes called mini publics, right? They're a stratified random sample of the larger public. Well, the rest of this talk is gonna focus on the public, right? The point of the Oregon CIR is not to show that 20 to 24 people can be excellent when they get together for 4 days. We actually already knew that. I mean, this kind of work has been going on for decades, and it's pretty well established that the deliberation just about always works in those kinds of situations, but doesn't have the larger impact. And the key for that larger impact is the voter guide. So Oregon, like many states that have direct democratic processes, has a voter's guide. The voter's pamphlet goes out to every household, and Oregon is a vote by mail state. I won't say more about that except that it's an excellent system. So that you get the ballot and you get the voter's guide. Now, just a fun fact for those with a keen eye who can see who signed this voter's pamphlet is Kate Brown, Oregon Secretary of State, who's now the governor of the state of Oregon. And in this voter's guide, you get information about candidates and the ballot issues. So here's, for instance, ballot title 73, the mandatory minimum sentencing law that Katie was talking about. And this is the first page in that guide that gives you the official state summary and the estimated fiscal impact. If you're curious, the reading level, and the measure itself is in there, the reading level for the measure itself as quantitatively assessed by these things is about a year of law school. And you've got to have a pretty good education to understand even the official summary. The CIR statement itself is about a high school level, maybe a year of college. And then the paid pro and con statements that actually can be bought in the voter's guide and fortunately come after the CIR statement, that requires about a middle school reading level. But it's that kind of in-between places where the CIR statement is, and it's so crucial. Reading it doesn't just give you kind of a bland summary of the law that doesn't tell you what you really want to know. It gets right to the heart of the issue, because that's, of course, what came out of that deliberation. Now, does that have an impact, right? Does reading the statement matter? The very first thing Katie and I did to get at that was a survey experiment, which has since been replicated year after year. And this is most of the results with one result hidden from that very first survey experiment. Now, for those who haven't done or read about survey experiments, it's like you're taking a survey. Imagine yourself on the other end of a phone or later on the internet. And you're asked how you would vote on measure 73, but it depends on which experimental condition we randomly placed you in. In the first group, no treatment, you can see that, roughly 2/3 of people, when asked how they would vote on this measure, said they would vote in favor. That's the green bar there. But in the second experimental group, because we're obsessive experimentalists, we had you read a letter from the Secretary of State that had no bearing on the issue at all. And of course, there's no effect. We just wanted to make sure reading wasn't affecting you. In the third group, you got that summary and fiscal impact statement, which I just showed you a second ago, and which is pretty common in states that have voters guide. There's something like that. Does it help? It doesn't make any difference at all. It doesn't really answer the questions you probably care most about, and it can be a bit impenetrable because public officials are super nervous about looking partisan. Well, you can guess what the fourth experimental condition is, right? 25% of the respondents dropped into this fourth condition, which saw the Citizens Initiative Review statement, that statement that was produced by the very citizens Katie was describing. Now, again, the answer to our first research question was the panel did a great job consistently year after year. They frankly, as a professor, it's kind of a B+ A- job, but you know what? That's pretty solid. They do a good job deliberating. They're very happy with the process. But do they have an impact? Well, yes, in a word. Yes, it certainly can. In this survey condition, when people were asked how they would vote, they actually turned against the measure. The effect was so large that Katie and I kind of closed the statistics program, went back to the raw data and worked our way all the way back here just to make sure we hadn't screwed up. But yeah, no, there it is. It was quite a striking effect. A fun little detail behind the scenes is a lot of the people who said that they opposed the CIR only did so when pressed by the interviewer. If you've ever answered one of these surveys and you say, well, I don't know, the survey interviewer usually says something like, well, if you had to choose, right, what would it be? And a lot of people were saying, well, I guess I would say no, right? Because they thought they were in favor of mandatory minimum sentences. Oregon had established such a law not too long ago on something else. So reading the statement threw them off, right? It didn't make them a committed opponent, but it threw them off. Now you see the actual vote was 57% in favor. Well, there's a few reasons for that. One is that only about 40-some% of Oregonians in the end became aware of the CIR that first year that it existed. So it changed some minds, but it also didn't reach a lot of voters. We'll look at a little more detail as we go. In fact, that first result kind of stands out in this graph. If your eye goes to the very bottom here and you look at that thick black line, what we're doing is we're moving across some issues to see what the effect of, again, survey experiment after survey experiment was of seeing the CIR statement. In that first case, it dropped support 30% for the measure. But as we move to the right, you can see that actually there's one measure where support went up after reading the CIR statement. And then curiously, that very last one, I'll say a word about in a second. The thinner gray line up above is the percentage of CIR panelists who themselves wound up favoring the measure. And that gives you a crude approximation of maybe what kind of tone you would expect in the whole CIR statement. So as the CIR panelists' support for a measure is higher and higher as you move to the right on this graph from one issue to the next, the voter support for the measure tends to go up, with one big exception, this last one, which is really telling because it turns out that voters are less interested in how the CIR panelists wound up voting themselves, how they split on the issue, which is published on the Oregon statement. They're more interested in what the statement says about the issue. And in this last case, the kicker tax, this was a measure brought forward by a progressive organization that was removing essentially a corporate tax loophole. And the problem was that the proponents of that measure said that it would raise funds for schools. Well, it couldn't really promise that because all it would do is raise funds for the state of Oregon. There was no way to guarantee that money would go to schools. And so that was disingenuous. The panelists themselves were really kind of annoyed when they realized that. They felt they'd been misled. But in the end, they thought this is a ridiculous tax loophole. No other state has this. Let's get rid of it. And they overwhelmingly voted in favor of the measure. But the very first thing in their statement was, hey, just so you know, it isn't true that this money is going to schools necessarily. It might, but that's up to the state legislature. And so voters reading that statement didn't pay attention to the vote split, which was something like 18-6 in favor. The first thing that hit them was, oh, by the way, you're being lied to. So I think that's just a really interesting fact that, again, the content of the statement really matters when it comes to influencing voters. Now, another thing we try to track is it making voters more knowledgeable? Set aside the question of how they end up voting. We really just want to know that reading the statement makes you more knowledgeable about the issue before you. And what you're looking at here is a series of experiments, a control group. You don't get the CIR information versus getting the statement. And you can see that your basically your score on this knowledge quiz that we give you goes up, 10 to 15% typically, which means you're getting another question or two right that you might not otherwise. So it's not a panacea. It doesn't make people into experts, but it does consistently make people more knowledgeable. And here's a happy fact. This graph has a lot to it, but bear with me. If we go from left to right, I've arrayed issues from issues that were most dear to the left in Oregon. There's that corporate tax loophole removal, to issues that were most dear to the political right. There's the mandatory minimums Katie told you about. As you move from left to right, what you're looking at is an increase in kind of a technical knowledge mastery score. For blue is Democrats, yellow independent, red Republicans. And you can see there's no real particular rhyme or reason to which group gets the greatest knowledge benefit. You might say the knowledge benefit kind of goes down as you go to the right, but actually on the most conservative issue, it was Republicans who showed the most gain in terms of their knowledge scores. And a recent article published in Political Psychology with a colleague shows that that's actually more common than you'd think, that the group that you would think would be most opposed to a new piece of factual information that maybe challenges their pre-existing beliefs actually is the group that gains the most from reading a CIR statement. If you think about it, they're the most wrong. So they have the most opportunity to improve their knowledge on that question. So Democrats tend to gain knowledge about uncomfortable facts for the left, and Republicans gain knowledge on uncomfortable facts for the right. You couldn't ask for a better result. Now, something Katie indicated earlier was, aside from changing people's minds about the issue or becoming more knowledgeable, can we change people's deeper attitudes? And this comes really right from Katie's dissertation research on the CIR. And there's a lot of information here, but basically the top of the graph is telling you that when we longitudinally measured people, that is, we measured them at one time and then later, we could actually see that if they became aware of the CIR, they became more inclined to think that the state of Oregon is a responsive government. That is, the government that created this thing to help citizens deliberate is a good government. If they read the statement itself, they became more confident in their own kind of political abilities, right? You read a statement, you become more knowledgeable, and it encourages that. In 2012, we replicated those results just with cross-sectional data and found a little bit more growth in people's confidence about the initiative election in general, from awareness of the issue of the CIR itself to actually reading the statement. And now another result, which I got to give credit to an undergrad here at Penn State. We were driving to the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation conference, and he wondered if reading the CIR statement made people more likely to vote. And I said, I don't really know. We could ask people. It's not a perfect measure. We don't have a behavioral measure in there. But when we ask people straight up, now that you've read this, does it make you more or less likely to vote? You can see very rarely does it cause people to say, well, now I'm not going to vote. Maybe I'm too confused or upset, right? But, and the most common response was, didn't make any difference. I would have voted anyway. But clearly a third of folks across a few different issues, whether we showed them the statement as part of an experiment or they just had come across it on their own before they took the survey. In either case, it actually did increase their likelihood of voting, which if you think about it makes sense, because sometimes the reason you don't want to vote on an issue is you don't really know what you're voting on, right? You have that uncomfortable feeling that maybe you've got it backwards, right? Or maybe there's something in there you don't know about. Well, and the CIR really helps with that. So it's encouraging to see that not only can it change your vote, make you more knowledgeable, change your attitudes towards government, but also just make you more inclined to feel that you're ready and capable to start voting. Now, the CIR, as we focus on in the book, is in the state of Oregon, where it's established as state law. Massachusetts is where the photo is from here, is the state that has a law that's up for consideration to adopt it. with some variations from Oregon that are important improvements we could talk about. It's been tried in various places, actually around the US. These are mostly pilot tests around the country. Also in Europe, Switzerland and Finland have experimented with variations on it, and people are looking at it in different countries all over the world and drawing inspiration from this basic idea, which is that a deliberative mini-public is a wonderful thing to behold. It's great for policymakers to watch everyday citizens deliberate on complex issues and come up with very reasonable recommendations. But the real power of the CIR is finding a way to connect that small mini public to the larger public. And that's what the voter guide does in Oregon. Without the voter guide, you could have a press conference, you could have civic organizations talking about the CIR, wouldn't really have much impact. The voter guide is a direct form of what another student here at Penn State calls deliberative media. It's a form of media that comes out unfiltered directly to voters in the most timely way possible, right into their mailbox, right around when the ballot arrives in Oregon, and gives them information they need when they need it to help them make up their mind. So sort of a final closing thought would be this. As Katie said before, we're hopeful for democracy, not because of, the balance sheet of the things that are going wrong in this country and around the world versus the things that are going right. We're hopeful because the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, just like things like the Irish Constitutional Convention, there's a new mini public in Belgium that's connected to a regional government in a formalized way. There's all these experiments that keep showing time and again, in spite of all of the things that beset democracy, everyday citizens are still incredibly competent deliberators and can interface with their government, or in the case of the CIR, with the larger public in a way that's very responsive and helpful. Now, that doesn't mean these democratic forms will be appreciated. It doesn't mean that they will be widely implemented, but it does mean that if they were, they would certainly help. And so that's what makes us hopeful for democracy, is the fact that there really are meaningful ways that we can change democracy for the better. The data backs it up. And so that's what leaves Katie and I at the end of the day wanting to share a message of hope, regardless of how personally hopeful we feel right at this moment in America. So we hope that that gives you something to feel good about. And we look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much to John and to Katie. So if we can, I've adopted this practice from all of the BA folks now. Luke is not with us tonight, but if we can do our little appreciation of some hands here. I don't know if you'll see all the little gallery photos, but they are there. Yes, John, thank you very much. I'm gonna, let me see if I can do this.
We saw the hands and it was wonderful.
Very well, I was really hopeful. I'm going to try a feature here of spotlighting the two of you a little bit more than kind of the whole group here for a moment, just to kind of start the question and answer here. So what I'm going to ask for folks to do is, if you've got some comments, some questions, really questions is what we're looking for more so than comments. And we're going to try to keep them relatively brief. So it's going to be really important. So if you've got those kind of in mind, if you want to kind of put yourself into the queue by using the hand raising feature, I'm seeing a few hands already. So we'll get that turned over in just a moment here. And what I'll do is I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. You can pose your question, and then we'll go forward from there. So it looks like the first person who's got a hand raised is Roger Haynes. So Roger, if you could unmute yourself and pose your question.
Hey, thank you very much for putting this on. This is always, I feel like I'm getting a college education from Braver Angels and the partners. So thank you. My question is, back in the late 80s, early 90s, I remember there were groups like, I think, Christian Coalition putting together voter guides. And I think what Oregon is doing is really amazing. I learned last night about the mail-in voting. are more organizations and states looking at doing this, and why aren't we doing more of this? I guess I should probably buy the book, but really appreciate your work. Thank you.
You should buy the book, but I'll let John and Katie respond to that too.
I'll take a stab at this one, Katie. One of our former students who's now in Arkansas, joined the university there, has focused on the voter guide question. And the main reason that states wind up adopting voter guides appears to be when their ballots become more complicated, which is because they have ballot initiatives all over them. So states like California can't help but have a voter guide because there's so much on the darn ballot. Now, that's not true for all states. And some states do have initiatives and referenda with no corresponding voter guide. But that's the trend. Now, the adoption hasn't necessarily caught on like wildfire of adopting those guides. Now, what you're pointing to are the sponsored guides created by various advocacy groups, and those are old and still continue to this day. I mean, they've obviously mostly gone electronic at this point. And then, of course, there's the League of Women Voters that has voter guides, and various municipal groups. The League of Women Voters guide is unfortunately, I think, distinguished by just having people send text to it and then they publish it. It's essentially publishing press releases. Yeah, you might be answering their questions, but you can say whatever you want and it just goes into the guide. Something like the Seattle Municipal League, on the other hand, tries to kind of vet the candidates. They're sort of their own citizens initiative review. The reason that we think the Oregon CIR is so important and special is that it's not the member of some specific organization. There isn't a way to get into it. You're just randomly selected in a way that's demographically representative. And there is some evidence that that matters to people. We haven't found that that's the key to public trust in this institution, but it does matter, I think, that they understand this is just everyday people like me, but they get an extraordinary opportunity to sit down for a few days and deliberate. I would love to do that. I'm not necessarily going to do what they did, as I won't necessarily agree with them, but I'd love to hear what they have to say.
So let me, just before we get into a couple more questions, let me ask something that I often hear about CIR, and because you were just mentioning it's representative, right? It captures, I think, this sense that it's not self-selected in the ways that we would often think about such things. But what does it actually take? What is required to kind of pull this off? And I maybe it's, not exclusively a monetary question, but like what actually is required to make something like this possible?
Sure. I mean, a lot of things. there's the institutional buy-in on the one hand, like they had to go through public and political processes to get the Oregon State Legislature to take a risk on the pilot process. Then they had to lobby the legislature to get it implemented permanently. I talked about Marion and other participants advocating for it. John and I's research was also a part of that work. We presented our research to the legislature, verifying for the quality of it, verifying for its impact on the public. So there's kind of that political process, but it's also labor and resource intensive. And I think that that's one of the key challenges of this work moving forward. If we compare it to things like an ad campaign for electoral politics, it's actually a minimal sum of money. But when we're asking people to support good government, it feels like a lot of money. So it takes a lot of manpower to, gather all of those folks together. They, in Oregon, they bring them all to a central location. So they have to house them and feed them. They pay them a stipend. All of that takes money. There's also a lot of kind of expertise in terms of developing the process guide, reaching out to experts and advocates, managing the whole thing. You always kind of have advocates trying to interfere with the process or saying that it's biased in one way or the other. So it's both a combination of like political willpower and a willingness for government officials to kind of take a chance on a new institution, and in many cases be willing to give up a little bit of the power that they hold, which is obviously a big ask for many of our elected officials. But it's also resource and labor intensive. The more local you get, the less resource intensive it is. The shorter the time frame, the less resource intensive it is. But it's, deliberation is it's a harder way of engaging. I don't think that should mean that we don't do it, but it's just an acknowledgement that if we really want to do democracy right, it requires a lot of us. You know, one of the great things about the CIR is it asks a lot of a few people instead of asking a lot of the entire public, so that the entire public can benefit from the work that those few people put into it. But those few people are working for, 5 days, 8-hour days, trying to just learn as much as they can about this initiative so that they can pass it along to the voters.
Yeah, no, that's great. I just know it. I hear that a lot from people, this question of like, well, how do we actually do this? What does it take? So that's an important one. Let me go back to the many hands that are raised, and I think Joanne Ward is who I see next. So Joanne, if you could unmute yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you. I appreciate this so much. I'm wondering how, in a state that isn't doing any of this, you talked about the resistance in the legislature to give up their power and to spend the money to make that happen. But can you give some suggestions about the champion that's going to lead the way? What kind of characteristics should we be looking for? Who should we find that can be the champion in a state situation? So how do you initiate that process where it doesn't exist?
Thanks, Joanne. Katie, John, who wants to take that one?
I'll jump in. Katie might add something.
Okay.
I think, and this isn't a shameless plug for the book, it's more how the book came about. It's really the story of individual people. In the case of Ned and Pat, they had been working on these things going back to the 70s and 80s, and were in some ways philanthropists and innovators. And then it's the story of younger people who didn't know better than to lobby the legislature and make something into a law. And it's just the people who happened to be there, who had these passions and so on. It's no coincidence that it didn't happen somewhere else. Okay, but then why Massachusetts, right? Why does it pop up in Massachusetts? Well, there was an undergraduate student at Brown University who read about deliberative democracy and got really interested in it, and then got an internship with a state legislator and started working in his office. And the legislator, God bless him, said, hey, you can pick one issue you're passionate about. And he said, well, there's this funny thing in Oregon, right? And so what I always tell people is start with what you got, right? This Oregon Citizens Initiative Review, Joanne, is a goofy thing. Right? It's a specific thing for a specific purpose. The idea is a big one, right? About deliberation, but really this is about cleaning up an initiative process. Now, if you think about the legislature, why would they support this? Well, in a state like Oregon, they're actually really worried about initiatives. They feel like it's taking power away from them. And people are making choices on one issue at a time without thinking about the cascading effects of those decisions. So they were ready for something to improve the initiative process, but they can't oppose the initiative because it's wildly popular. People in states like Oregon love the initiative and they think it needs to be reformed. They recognize that they don't have information. So the CIR is the perfect fit for what the legislature needs and what the public wants. So in your case, Joanne, or maybe where Roger is for the first question, it's going to depend on who's there, right? The specific individuals and organizations, and then kind of what are the most pressing needs. It may be that a mini public can fit in as part of a solution, or it may be that something very different, which is maybe in one of the other sessions of this series, is the perfect fit. So I can't say that it works in every place for every purpose because it really came about organically.
Yeah, it's a great question. And importantly, I think as was mentioned earlier, CIR, Citizens Initiative Review, is one model of this kind of mini public, right? These small publics of people representative of a larger body that are happening across the United States and across the country. So I think Katie, you were saying it earlier, right? This is just one among many of these frankly, sometimes really organic, and other times in some hybrid form with politicians who recognize their systems are challenged or sometimes really even flawed, but they can't do some of the things that they might aspire to do. Let me just note real quick, I've seen a couple comments about this. This is being recorded and will be available later. And also a question about slides. I know, careful what you're saying. Those great images, those graphics will be available. So don't you fret, or if you're like me, you take screenshots in these moments, which is always awful. So you will get the real deal later. So don't have that be consuming your mind as we're spending our time together here. it looks like Ross Collier. I've split the name up here. Apologies if that's one long name, but Ross, if you're able to.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are
Okay.
loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you for your research and your work and your presentation all. I have two quick questions. One has a CIR or like organizations report. Have the facts presented ever been challenged? That's one. And the second is, have one of these deliberative bodies ever had to ask someone to leave, to no longer participate? And if so, what would have been the reasons for that? Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that question.
That's an easy one. Not yet and not yet. The challenges that come to the statements aren't usually direct hits on the factual claims, but an organization might say, well, that's not what we think is most important or something. What's more interesting is campaigns that use the statements. And in one of the cases where private casinos are eager to get established in Oregon, the CIR may have been their last ditch effort in a campaign that was not going well. And then, you know, there was nothing to say when it came out, when the statement came out, they were like, well, it's been good knowing you, Oregon. So, you know, if any group, I mean, and they had fought tooth and nail during the process itself, challenged every fact, every claim. But once the statement was written, I don't know, maybe they thought they'd look like an idiot if they tried challenging it.
Great.
Yeah, I also to end up in the statement itself, it has to be approved by a supermajority. So 2/3 of the panelists have to agree that it's factual and important. And so each of the statements, particularly like the argument section, doesn't really contain key facts in the same way. It might contain factual arguments, but the key findings are facts that have been thoroughly vetted, and they are sourced, and you can tie back to what study it came from pretty easily. So by the time it gets into the statement, it's gone through so much vetting that we haven't seen a challenge yet. I mean, people say we live in a post-fact society, so that doesn't mean it won't happen. But there's a lot of work that happens in the process to make sure that those facts are accurate.
I think what's a more pressing concern for other people who have joined Katie and I in studying this and looking at it and worrying about it, as opposed to, hearing about it and thinking, gosh, I wonder, what they start to worry about is, gosh, I wonder what gets left out. I think Katie would agree that there are some really important facts that didn't quite make the cut. Maybe they were effectively challenged by the other side, but in the end, it really should have been in there. Well, the citizens didn't think it didn't reach that threshold. So it's a little bit more of a concern about what gets left out than whether something bad gets left in. Though that said, the very first CIR almost did have a real error in it. But the process has various kind of correction steps along the way. And one of my favorite things is that the pro and con sides at different CIRs have had the chance to actually critique each other's statements, and they're often helping each other. Right. When you say drug offender, people might not know what we're really talking about. Remember, we want to make sure we say marijuana, because otherwise they might think you're talking about cocaine or something. Oh, right. Yeah, I didn't mean that. Right. So there's this collaborative spirit in even writing the arguments for the side you oppose, which makes it a pretty solid statement.
And on that point, the idea that the CIR is really representative of kind of quote ordinary people, does that, that veracity of information, is there a challenge to that, or just that previous question is making me think about this, of how does this get ensured, to Katie's point, right, of the kind of post-factual space that we seem to exist in? For people who haven't looked at this kind of document, are there citations? Are there references to things? Are statements grounded in certain sources that folks could verify a claim, for example?
On occasion, they'll say according to something that, like, they'll cite it kind of the way that magazines cite things.
Okay.
But for the most part, no, the citations are not included in the text of the statement itself.
Because frankly, it's probably easier to read, and
Yeah.
part of that process is to actually go through that. So the trustworthiness, if you want to say it that way, is that it probably, as John noted a minute ago, probably has been kind of vetted and cleared that we could trust it. Yeah. Well, great. Thanks. Elizabeth Jeffries. Are you out there? We may come back to Elizabeth. Eli, let's
Can you hear me?
oh, yep, Elizabeth, you snuck in. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to first say thank you for your time tonight. I wasn't expecting to be so inspired. I was just planning to hear a positive message, and if I liked it, go rent the book at the library. So my to-do list is to buy the book first thing tomorrow morning.
Yeah,
That's
and just for the
reasonable.
record, we were only paid $5. We only paid $5. Is all we offered for her, that endorsement. So we're cheap. I mean, but if you want to represent us at a future event, just check in with Katie by email, and we'll get you the book.
Okay. I really am interested in the whole concept of deliberative democracy. I hadn't heard of it before tonight. So I think it was Roger that said that it was a like taking a college class tonight. Anyway, like Joanne, I'm interested in seeing how I can start doing something locally. So if anybody here is from South Florida, let me know. It's exciting to know that everybody is collaborating from all over, which maybe is the one of the silver linings of what's happening with us now. So my question actually was already answered.
Oh no, okay.
I was just asking about how to start, and I think the answer was it's really organic. So
Well, if it's okay, let me kind of take Elizabeth, your comment and turn it into a bit of a question, because I imagine some others who maybe aren't familiar with something like deliberation. What John and Katie, there are a number of networks and organizations that are really committed to different forms of deliberation, some that are more structured like CIR, and others that are truly more kind of community-based, organic, even though there are a lot of resources. Would you recommend or point people to any? I'm thinking of a handful, but I'd rather err on the side of the speakers tonight to maybe mention some examples that Elizabeth and others might kind of inquire about, and we can include in the chat box the links to them as well.
Yeah, if you want to, so deliberation takes all forms. It can be institutional and connected to government like the CIR is, but it can also just be people having a good conversation over Zoom or in their living room. So if you're interested in kind of trying out this type of engagement, there are organizations like Living Room Conversations, Make America Dinner Again. There's just a whole bunch of organizations. You can go to the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, and they kind of, it's a great starter place to start figuring out what's out there. And I think have a map that you can see, is there anything happening in my community? But you can host those conversations yourself, invite your family at a dinner table to print out a conversation guide and talk through whatever issues you think are important. You can organize a Zoom call with your friends or your coworkers or whomever and talk through an issue. If that turns into, we're all going to write letters at the end of tonight after we've thought more about this, then that's great. But there's also a real value in learning how to have those conversations better for ourselves so that we can think about our own interests. We can hear about how things impact other members of our community. And it also helps you connect with people. So whether it's a cross difference or whether it's someone that you've been knowing for a long time, we so often shy away from these conversations, but there's a lot of great resources out there that will kind of help you get started and just kind of learning how to have a better conversation about politics.
I have just, I preemptively, I assumed you were going to say a couple of those, Katie. So I threw into the chat box a few of these links, and I can add a few more. They're really a range, and depending on the models, there's really a spectrum of resources. So NCDD, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, is a really good place to start. It also is like putting your face up against a hose and turning it on, because there's so many things available. But the National Issues Forums Institute, Living Room Conversations was mentioned. I will plug also the National Institute for Civil Discourses, Engaging Differences, would be kind of in this spirit. So that's one resource among many. Golden Rule 2020, which is another one of our NICD efforts right now with faith communities, are, I think, just a few of the examples. Everyday Democracy, and I could just keep going, and so could the speakers. But there's a number of organizations and resources that could be useful as a complement to, I think, the efforts that for a number of you who are part of Braver Angels or connected with NICD, or just kind of curious in the ways that you've shown up tonight, you could find, I think, some really accessible material that doesn't require your buy-in from your state legislative body and a pot full of money to make it work. Not that that is a bad thing, but we can think about it from the kind of the range and the spectrum here. So, Eli Persky, you were getting prompted a moment ago, so if you could unmute and pose your question, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. This is Eli in Minneapolis. My question is there a rating scale for the deliberative maturity of a government? And thank you for everything.
Oh, great question.
Easily answered. No, there is not. I dig the idea, but I'll offer a couple things. There is something called the Discourse Quality Index, which is a funky way of measuring the quality of deliberation in anything from a legislative body to a process like this. Just to give you, one fun fact, it kind of depends on your political system. As you might not be surprised, there's some European democracies that do really well on that, and others that don't do as well. And then deliberative Democrats also like to talk about the deliberative system. That is, something like a mini public is a cool thing, right? It's a neat invention and so on. I mean, the Greeks kind of invented it, and some native nations have used some interesting little variants on the deliberative processes. But the idea of a deliberative system is that you should care about everything, right? What is Facebook feeding into the system? What is the public school system feeding in? How lively are the arts? The arts are sometimes the way questions even get on the agenda, and challenges are raised to, assumptions and so on. So there is something called the VDEM project, the Varieties of Democracy project, which Tim is associated with, that tries to measure systems at a big national level. But it's tough. It's really tough to measure deliberative democracy in that sense. And that's why there isn't really a good index. I would love it if there were. And I don't doubt that there are people interested in developing it, but it hasn't been developed to date.
Yeah, just a quick note, because I'm fast fingered and sitting on my work computer. I've put in the Discourse Quality Index, an article that's available, so it's not gated. You can access it. And also the VDEM, the world's largest data set actually on democracy questions for the last 120 years. There was a comment, and maybe just it's worth to note here, and maybe John and Katie, if you'd have a response to this too, is distinguishing of what we're talking about. So not necessarily conflating deliberation with dialogue and conversation of where these are all kind of synonymous with one another, but truly the deliberation that you're talking about is there's a robustness, right? Katie, you've actually written, right, an article, if I'm quoting this correctly, right? Did they deliberate? I'm not making that up, right? Or did they deliberate enough? Is that correct? Okay. So can you distinguish, and can you maybe clarify a little bit, since we just rattled off a bunch of resources that would literally doesn't require much more than sitting in a living room or maybe on a Zoom chat. How is that different from the deliberation that happens through something like CIR in a really quick way?
Sure. The simplest way to think about it is a deliberative conversation is focused on learning and making a better decision as a result of that learning. And that's opposed to a lot of political conversations that are focused on winning. So that's my kind of always my home is like, are we focused on making a better decision? Or are we focused on winning the argument? If you're focused on winning the argument, then you're going to ignore the information that goes against your beliefs and you're not going to learn, right? And then you're probably going to make a bad decision. John, among others, has kind of worked to think about the different criterion for deliberation. So we often talk about it being information-based or analytically rigorous, that it's democratic in the way that the conversation's conducted. So we respect one another's positions, we ask questions, we try to learn and think about each other's values. And then you make a decision that's just. So those are kind of the key components. I think if we're thinking about our everyday conversations, I like to talk about ground rules. So those are things that we use at our deliberative processes that help people understand how to have this conversation differently. And our ground rules are things like listen to understand, be tough on the issue, not on the person. It's okay to disagree, but do so respectfully. So those are kind of some different ways about thinking about whether or not you're deliberating. Are you trying to win? Are you trying to learn? Are you using solid information, or are you just saying whatever comes to the top of your head? Are you respecting other people, or are you adamant that your way is the only way?
Great. No, that's really helpful. I appreciate the question that kind of prompted a little bit of that, because we can be a little sloppery sometimes with the terms, and so there's I think a real usefulness, because there is a serious kind of robust nature to what you're talking about. People spending time wrestling with kind of the factual information coming from sources and engaging one another in truly this analytic and also democratic kind of way. So I appreciate you saying a little bit more there. Thanks. Jeff Dietrich, are you there?
I'm here.
There you are. Go ahead.
Well, I also found this to be really interesting. I will say that what got me involved with Better Angels was an event called America in One Room, which was a deliberative democracy event where they recruited 525 people from all across the United States with all sorts of different backgrounds. I mean, there were green people there. It was amazing. But we went through a process where we listened to people's opinions, try to understand why they feel what they do about things. Then we went to a plenary session where they actually provided experts. And the interesting part was the experts were from the left and the right, and also sometimes somebody from the middle. And it was really interesting to hear how they discussed it between themselves in terms of helping flesh out what the real issues are. The other part of that is they also added something that I thought was beneficial, in that they talked about surveys, so you could try to understand where people feel or where people are at that needs to be overcome. So in my opinion, a lot of people that were there were not very well informed. And even for somebody who was well informed, I thought it was really fascinating to hear what they had to say. And it changed my mind about things that I wouldn't necessarily have done. Then we went back to our small groups once again, and we tried to come up with, we didn't try to solve any problems. We just tried to figure out where we had agreement. And we talked about actually at a kind of a different level than what you do, and that'll bring to my question. We talked about taxes and the economy, foreign policy, healthcare and insurance, immigration, and environmental issues. But at the end of this thing, it was transformative, and individually, it really changed people's opinions. They did a lot of surveying of us afterwards, and we all came to the center, no matter, it was pretty dramatic how much people's minds came together. It didn't matter on whether you were right, left, green, or whatever.
So Jeff, is there you're alluding to a question there. Is there?
Yes.
Is there one?
So my
okay.
question is, are you guys ever going to start trying to tackle any of these bigger issues rather than just local initiatives? I thought we really made progress on the bigger issues. I don't know how you can communicate that to politicians. We did all agree, though, I think that politicians stood in the way of solving the problems. Okay, sorry, there's my question.
So this is, you answered your own question, Jeff. if it's going to be politically relevant, it has to be relevant to politicians. And in Oregon, the moment of relevance came and went in a fine way. That is, the politician said, you know what, we'd like to have this, but this is really for citizens to talk to citizens. And so it's kind of self-perpetuating in a way. They don't need to be involved. But in most other cases, this does come back to a legislative question. Now, there are interesting variations. So in British Columbia, Canada, the legislature handed over the question of how to change the electoral system to the public. And then when the mini public came up with its recommendation, they directly put that on the ballot. Ireland more recently did that a little bit more famously, and that's the reason that Ireland has now changed its laws on blasphemy and abortion, is that those questions were put to the wider Irish public. That came about from a mini public. And, you know, we could go through example after example, but the frustrating thing is that when a process like America in One Room or other deliberative polls in the United States have happened, sometimes they've been incredibly timely and just had no impact. I have to go back several years to when George Bush Sr. Was considering military action in the Middle East in response to Iraq. This isn't 9/11, we're years before that. And there couldn't have been a more timely deliberative poll. There was a deliberative poll on the question of what the US response should be. Philadelphia Inquirer got involved. I think PBS got involved. And the deliberation was quite telling. The public shifted in the surveys. The deliberative poll is famous for having before and after surveys. The public shifted strongly in favor of multinational sanctions. They didn't think this really called for a military intervention. They thought the global community could isolate Iraq and so on. Even people who study deliberative democracy, even people who write about deliberative polls, don't even know that happened, right? Let alone the general public, let alone a politician who would care one way or the other. So many of these things we kind of put on the balance sheet as a good experiment. It proved that you can have really meaningful deliberation on timely, difficult, complex, big issues, whether to go to war. Now the question is, how do you build that into your institutional infrastructure in a way that's meaningful? In the United States, we're not really near anything like that on a national scale. But in other countries, again, scattered across Europe and actually here and there around the world, they really have been quite timely. And in the case of Japan, for instance, a deliberative poll had a direct impact on nuclear policy, nuclear power policy. So it can happen, but you have to have the right government and the right public and the right infrastructure, civic infrastructure, to make it all come together and be politically relevant.
We've mentioned the Ireland example a couple times, the Irish Citizens Assembly. So I threw it into the chat box. And in fact, it's a very small little book. It usually costs $5, but in fact, it is free as an EPUB or a PDF. I didn't know it until I just clicked there because I have it somewhere in my mess of an office. But it's a great little text, but it highlights another international example of what it looks like to put together these kinds of bodies of people and then actually have a tangible outcome for them. In fact, this is not about the Irish Citizens Assembly, but they were able to make moves that their elected body was unable to because of this process. So it's really significant. The next person up, it looks like Matt Byrne.
Hi. I actually want to follow up on what we just talked about and ask, you know, are you aware, you say that it depends on the country and that the civic infrastructure kind of is the determining factor. And I'm curious if you could go a little bit deeper, like what are you looking for in a malleable and kind of influenceable civic infrastructure? Is there a study that shows what the patterns are about different attempts and when they've been politically relevant and not?
Great question.
No. That's the short answer. I mean, there are a lot of people working really hard to figure out, you know, I think one of the things we're yearning for in this conversation is like, just fix it, right? Like our system is broken. What can we do to fix it? And the truth is the things that have really mattered, the deliberative processes that have really mattered have really figured out specific leverage points and figured out specific designs to match those leverage points. So I think it goes from the local to the global, you know, like where what is the decision being made? Who has the power to make that decision? How willing are they to work with the public? And then you can kind of start to figure out, all right, what's an intervention that we could do right here? What power do we have? What resources do we have? Whatever it might be. You know, we talk a lot about like scaling it up and putting it on the big scale. And I think that that's really important. And that's a lot of where our attention goes. I do a lot of work at the local level, and I kind of wish that we would start talking about that again, because there are so many places at the local level where we have power and you could demand this of your, you know, if you get enough people in your city together that says, we want a voice in this thing and we want to run this process, you know, it's quite possible. Our city has been transformed by the, I think at least, by the implementation of deliberative processes, but it really, like, it'd be great if we could be like, there's this fix that we could implement and this is what it's going to take. But in reality, our political systems are so complex and decisions are getting made at so many different levels that it really is about thinking deeply about every stage of the decision-making process, from who gets to decide what's on the agenda, to who gets to decide what's important about that issue, to what policies we put forward, to our elected officials, right? There's so many different decision-making points. And I think that the job that deliberative systems and deliberative democracy, the folks that are working in this field are really trying to do is figuring out points of intervention that can matter and figuring out ways to intervene that empower the public and that are based in information and that are connected to power. And that it's a struggle.
Yeah, and maybe, yeah, and maybe you alluded to a little bit where you are in Fort Collins, Colorado State, the Center for Public Deliberation, of which you're the associate director. You've worked on a number of very local issues, right? Even like waste management and like broadband internet and I mean the host of issues. And there are these kind of these little hubs around the country, often not exclusively, but often at universities and colleges. The institute that I direct here at Kansas State, for example, is another one of these kind of nodes that has this kind of work happening. But the scale of this, even back to our question earlier about the spectrum from the conversation, the dialogue to deliberation, the informal to the more formal, can and in fact does happen at these very local kind of scales, right? So this doesn't happen because some of the examples, I want to be careful that, you know, we've thrown a couple examples out here of the work that's happening at the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford, that America in One Room that was being referenced earlier, right? Massive scale. The deliberative polling work from which that's coming has happened internationally, but for a different kind of audience than a lot of how we're probably going to operate, right? So it's important to not have it only exist purely in some wow, that's fascinating, but what do we do, or what's possible for us?
I want to add a different wrinkle here, which Matt, I think, was the one asking this last question, but it cycles back to some other questions. Maybe it's taking my mind back to Eli asking for sort of an index of how well the government's doing. We're in an election year, and truth in advertising, I used to run elections. My mom ran for Congress in '92. My dad ran in '76. So I was raised in a political family. And I used to joke that it was sort of a paradox that I studied democracy and American politics, two unrelated fields. And now that joke feels kind of mean. Actually, now it's kind of scary. But the point is that I'm actually comfortable with both identities. I very much believe in deliberative democracy. I want to do rigorous research on it. I want to find out what works, and that's Katie and I devoted 10 years to this in this case. And we're really excited about the findings, even though, for academics, they'd say, oh, I see it works a bit, right? That's a fair summary. But there's this other side, which is, okay, well, now who are the legislators in Oregon? Maybe you should pay attention to who's running for office. And so, when are we going to see something bigger than, this small state in the Pacific Northwest? Well, I think there was a near miss, actually. Republican Secretary of State candidate Pete Peterson in California, was a real viable candidate for Secretary of State in California, which, if you didn't know, is either the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. Now, he was very much involved in all this stuff. He knows, I attended, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. He can talk deliberative democracy. He knows about all this stuff and is super interested in it. Had he become Secretary of State, we'd be maybe having a different conversation, right? So I would just encourage you, and I know it goes back to all the way back to the local level, who's on your school board and so on, but you know what? The people who become your state representative, become your attorney general or become your governor. So I think that's how it's going to happen. Is that there are people, again, in the case of Massachusetts, it was a legislative aide, for crying out loud, not exactly a power broker. So cultivate these relationships, and hopefully this will develop over time. But it's a combination of being, aware of ideas like this, attending an event like this, and being a part of civic organizations that matter. But then there is also that being involved in politics, and you got to be comfortable with that, right? I have to be comfortable running a process where I am uncommitted to the outcome, right? Whatever the citizens say, oh, geez, really, you guys? Fine, whatever. I'm a deliberative Democrat. And then on the other hand, I'm a Democrat with a capital D, right? And I work for this political party. Well, you can work for your political party, but whatever party it is, or independent, I hope that you're working for candidates who start to understand and care about deliberation before they're in office, so that they can use that office as a platform for advancing ideas like this.
So actually, there was a question that came in the chat, so I'm going to plug that in because it's so salient right here. And it was, are there any politicians that include kind of deliberative democracy as part of their platform? And the thing that I would add to that a little bit is just, as you're thinking about that, if you can identify anybody, is that Pete Peterson, the person in California, is a Republican, right? And so this is not something that falls on one end of the political spectrum.
The British Columbia Citizens Assembly I alluded to, that proposed an election reform. That was a conservative political party. Yeah. And if you think about it, if you're a political conservative, and I don't mean that in any Trumpian sense of whatever Trump says, I mean in the more philosophical sense of conservative. If you're a conservative, you want things to move slowly. Change is fine, but the status quo is there for a reason, right? Well, what does deliberation do? It slows things the heck down. Right. All right. If you're a conservative, you believe there are people who know more than other people. Right. There are people who have a different status that they've earned, and that we should respect. Well, what does deliberation do? It gets a random sample of the public. That's egalitarian, makes me a little Quaker self happy. But then it brings in experts. It brings in content experts who know what they're talking about. I mean, again, so it can have a strong appeal to conservatives. But historically, and I think this is unfortunate, in the United States, it has been associated with the left and progressives and egalitarian, even though the left sometimes attacks these things, as you'd see in the book, has happened in Oregon.
Yeah, and that's probably why I wanted to mention that a little bit here, so it doesn't just get framed. And this is where I think the again, back to the comment earlier about tomorrow, maybe your first thing is to find hope for democracy wherever you might find such things. It captures, I think, some of this essence of the complexity of not kind of putting some of this in one spot or another. Elaine Butterfoss, you've been waiting diligently. There's a few more hands, so we'll get to them in a moment. But Elaine, if you're all set.
Yes, I'm here.
All right.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for this whole program. This has been fascinating and very interesting. Now, in Delaware, we do not have any opportunity to vote on initiatives.
Yeah, that's our case too in Kansas.
Okay, so I think how might something like this with a deliberative process impact our state legislators who make all the decisions? We can write letters, which we do. We kind of contact our legislators, but how might this process impact us, those of us who live in states where there is no opportunity to vote on initiatives?
That's a great question. And like I didn't mean to interrupt there, but that's the case that I'm in. And so when I talk about CIR as a professor, I have to lament that we don't have this immediate experience or example to draw on. So, and John's shaking his head, no, right? I mean, so what, right? So is this just the novelty of those who happen to live in the right states?
Hey, Tim, have you ever voted on a bond measure?
I have.
Really? So you actually voted directly on a substantive policy question, but I thought you lived in a state that doesn't have that.
Oh, look at you. Well done. So,
no,
so not
it's
so
true.
not exactly,
I mean,
right?
it's true. There's all kinds of stuff. It's not, if not at the state level, right? In
Right.
Pennsylvania, people said, "Why'd you move to Pennsylvania?" Right? They don't even have that. Well, lo and behold, I had hardly been here a year when we had a constitutional amendment, which does appear on the ballot, and the constitutional amendment proposed establishing a retirement age for state Supreme Court justices. And the public said, well, that's a fine idea. Let's have that. And many voters didn't realize the point of the measure was to raise the retirement age to protect one justice. It sure did sound like we were establishing one, which seemed like a good idea. No, actually, we were jacking it up. So you might find yourself in a situation where actually that does kind of apply. But I think there's a larger lesson. That's why Katie and I like to say this is just one example. And it may not be the case that you're going to have many cases where important things are being put on your ballot. Maybe there are some bond measures and so on. But in those cases, again, we're just talking about many publics today. There are lots of other ideas. There's neat stuff that the National Institute for Civil Discourse does, working with legislators.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, yeah.
To try to change the quality of their deliberation. And they've reported that they've had some success with that. I'm still kind of waiting for the academic report on that. But there's no reason why it shouldn't, because really a lot of the people who are elected at the state level really do care about the quality of politics and deliberation. And so hopefully you can cultivate a different kind of politics.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good reference that I think John, you were saying a little bit earlier, and I'll throw this into the chat box. A program called Next Generation of NICD is explicitly for state legislators, and for them to be able to engage across difference in more kind of constructive ways, not being limited just to talk about civility, but really in a kind of this more functional way. In large part because those who are at that level kind of move up to a federal level, and if we think about it from the local, so the school boards and city councils and the like, kind of moving up in ranks, this notion of intervention, if you want to think about it that way, to say those who aspire potentially to other roles that might have a wider impact are increasingly being schooled in some of these practices. So the link, you can take a little bit of a look at that. And a number of states, I will say, here in Kansas, for example, we had one early this calendar year, and just yesterday, I continue to be in conversation with about a dozen legislators from across the parties, extremely conservative to rather liberal, in both houses, who we're already planning for next year to do another kind of larger event for these conversations. So these types of efforts can and are happening, which is, I think, a really good reminder of the importance of it. So, Tomer Applebaum, you are unmuted? I see that. All right, so go ahead.
Am I allowed one question or two?
See how well you do with one and how quick you are, and then we'll get
Okay, so I'll start with the second one, even though it's the most tricky one. I got the book on Audible. I'll listen to it tomorrow. I want to start by saying that I really love the initiative. I think the more people talk with each other, the better this country will be. However, you were talking about, it seems to me that this process is most effective in helping involve the public in the law writing aspect of democracy, and much less so in the executive function. Like you gave an example, you were talking about the Iraq War, and I saw an example a bit closer to home, if this is based in Oregon, of the riots that have been ransacking Portland for recent 2 months, going on 3 now. So how is there any way that this can be used to engage the public in executive issues, such as what's going on there? I would really love to see Oregon's public involved in the level of rioting and violence that has seemed to gone out of hand in Portland. And let me add my condolences for your unpleasant state of affairs.
All right. So we'll stop there and kind of go to John and Katie responses.
I'm hoping to hand this one to you, Katie.
I know I'm watching you both kind of wait the other one out.
I'm sorry.
Somebody needs to go.
Should I have started with a smaller question with the one that's more
No, it's okay.
nuts and bolts?
No, this is good.
This is fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the problem is that you're asking for an intervention in a place where someone has power, right? Like, and they're a great executive, I think, wants to listen to the public and wants to open it up and wants to involve folks in that conversation. But you know, there are decisions that executives make that they've got the power to make, and so I think that that's just a reality of our system, and that's where we get strategic, and that's where we do the electoral work and all of that. You know, I can't think of a specific example right now of an executive handing over power that way. But I also don't think that those things are like, I don't think you always have to wait for someone to give you power, right? Like, you know, one of the things that I think there have been a few kind of questions that are like, what individual should I look to, or what type of person does this? And the reality is that there are people who are leading the way, but they're never people working on their own. That this field is a field of teamwork, and democracy is teamwork. So if you think that this issue is important, then you get people together and you have conversations, or you host demonstrations. I mean, the protests in Oregon are an example of people getting together and doing the work and saying, I demand a seat at the table, right? That's why we see that energy on the streets, is because people feel that they don't have a voice, right? And when people don't feel like they have a voice, you know, we talk at the beginning of the book about alienation, and part of the work of deliberation is that it allows people to overcome alienation. But when people feel disconnected, when people feel disaffected and that they don't have a say, the end result is that they either check out of the system or they find extra legal means. So the same things that are encouraging people to show up at a state capitol with their machine gun is the same thing that's encouraging somebody to burn down the building, right? It's that they don't feel like they have a voice. So if the government isn't going to give us a voice, then we find ways in our own community to band together and make our voice heard, right? It might be a demonstration. It might be we got together and had a deliberative conversation, and then every single one of us wrote a letter to the editor, right, about what we thought at the end of that conversation. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can kind of claim our voice, but those ways are very rarely going to be powerful unless we work together to do it. And I know that we often talk about like our politicians when we talk about our government, but in reality, democracy is an act of the public. And it's not going to get fixed unless the public really kind of takes it on and does the work and shows up at elections and shows up at city council meetings and has conversations with their neighbor and reads the local newspaper. It's going to take all of those things, and it's going to take all of us.
Right.
Okay, and the last question.
Is this a quick one? Just I want to be sensitive.
Yeah, this one is much easier. It seems to me, and you guys touched upon it a little bit, that a lot of the value of this depends on how you frame the question, how you choose the deliberators. If you could talk a little bit about what protections you take care to make sure that the process isn't corrupted, that there's a good representation of different points of view on each issue, and that the presentation of the issue itself is as neutral as possible.
Great. Yeah, that's a super question. I think probably.
Yeah, so there's a single answer to both of those, which is when you run a process like this, it's just got to be transparent, and you want to bring to the table not just the sort of civic professionals, the kinds of groups and stuff that Katie and I work with, but also the advocates for the issue and their opponents, right? So let them see how you select people. And citizens juries have even done this with a big board, you know, and here's the names on the board. It's almost like jury selection, except you understand it's got to be representative. You don't really know much about these people except a few demographics and so on. And then when it comes to picking the experts, there's a lot of variations on that. And that is something to be concerned about. That is something that you have to be very careful about. But the solution, again, is you let both sides bring whoever they think will make a credible case. And I think it's always better when you also have a slate of neutral experts that, again, both sides can accept, right? And so in the state of Oregon, if you're proposing a big tax change, you want to hear from someone from the state revenue office, right? And so on. And so that tends to work out really well. I'll tell you, some people who study deliberative democracy and these mini publics in particular, one point that researchers have been drilling into, I keep having to say to folks, well, you know, nobody's looking at that. But people are looking at this question of just how much influence do those neutral experts have? And so some people worry that they have too much influence because they're kind of the most credible voice in the room. But one of the responses I have to that is, well, that actually means the proponents and opponents did a terrible job of bringing in their own experts. Because if you bring in hacks for your experts, people will say, well, you brought hacks, so I'm just going to listen to the neutral expert. If you bring in good experts, man, they can be persuasive. And as Katie tells, I mean, I got to give Katie the credit for the more narrative parts of the book. Man, you can really do a terrible job of presenting your case. You can have great TV commercials, you can have emotionally riveting, you know, catchphrases and so on. But man, if you don't have the evidence in a 4-day process, you're going to get eaten alive, right? You're going to look like an idiot. And that's deliberation, baby. Right? You know, if you don't have good arguments, if you don't have good evidence, this week is not going to go well for you. And you can see organizations that have come back more than once learning from that and saying, yeah, okay, this is a whole different arena. Right. I have to make an argument that will stick and that has, you know, that can withstand scrutiny.
Yeah. And this is where, I mean, importantly, I think you just mentioned it briefly, but the CIR is extended for a number of days. So think about that as compared to a 30-second clip in the middle of your evening television, right? I mean, so this extreme kind of experience of actually getting deeply into the issue and not just simply the sound bites or kind of the preferred wording.
I love the passion of both of you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, well, great. Thanks for your questions. Even though you snuck that one in, that was a good one. So it already happened, so I guess I can't do anything as a moderator. Ted Wetzel, you and Audrey are the hanger-ons here. So let's have you. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Katie and John. Has this tended to reduce the amount of spending in elections so that the influence of big money is lessened?
Ooh, so a great money question. We were talking earlier about how much does this cost, but Ted's question is what influence does this have?
I want to hear what Katie says. My quick answer is no, it hasn't had a big structural effect like that. But with at least one exception, remember I alluded earlier to the private casinos, they basically pulled their money out of that election. And that really was a direct result of the fact that they got clobbered. You know, and one of my favorite things about that is that's one of the only cases I think where a citizens initiative review statement made a very strong values argument, more or less saying, hey, you know what? The native people of the Pacific Northwest have had a really bad few centuries. Now they have these casinos and they're making some good money. There's reason to be concerned these private casinos will undo maybe the one, you know, thing that broke their way in the last century. So yeah, no, I don't think so. And so, you know, if it caused them to just stop campaigning, well, you can say in a way that actually saved the pro campaign a ton of money too. I mean, excuse me, it saved the con campaign, those arguing against private casinos. So that's an impact. Katie, would you add anything to that?
I mean, that was the one I was going to refer to as somebody dropped out of the race. So that was spending less money. You know, I think another interesting story from that same issue though, was the guy who was leading the campaign against the casinos. When we were talking about the CIR and we were talking about why campaigns decide to do it, or there have been campaigns that have boycotted the CIR because they didn't want to expend their energy or, I don't know, put their argument in front of the audience, whichever it was. We were talking about that, and he said that he actually used the CIR as kind of a focus group. So he's testing out all these arguments and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So I think that, you know, it could kind of go both ways. We haven't, John maybe knows, we haven't really seen much of it being uptaken by advocacy campaigns, but I think that there is some ways that advocacy campaigns use it as a testing ground for what's going to be the most persuasive, what's going to be the most resonant with people.
Great. We've got a couple more questions. We've got a few more come in. We've got a little bit more time, so if that's still okay, that'd be great. So Audrey Balloon, or I don't know if I said that correctly.
No, you've got that right.
Great.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I Um, I wanted sort of to follow up with Tamar Applebaum talking about people, not legislation writing. That's where my questions are focused, and I'm going to do him one better. I'm going to try to get in several questions.
Well, let's start with one. Let's go
All
there.
right,
Don't
okay.
get sneaky on me, Audrey.
Uh, well, it's a general question. It all kind of is one ball of wax. I feel like the problem with, I mean, I love Braver Angels. I love all these organizations because, but somebody said in one of the debates, we're preaching to the choir, and it's hard to get good um, uh, uh, good interactions with people who don't want to join or don't or feel that well, I think Katie put it well. She said, are we here to learn or to win? And then I would ask, to what end? Because I am always here to learn, but I wonder how much how has there been any research about has anyone's mind really been changed? Are we just mentally playing games here? Are we really getting somewhere? If people do learn, do they change their mind? That's one thing. The other thing is behind that, there's a backdrop, and it feels like that we used to really be, and I'm much older than a lot of you. So in the caves, when we, Orr and Ugg and I used to really be able to discuss these things, but after coming out of the caves, I'm that old, I have to tell you. So
Audrey, Orr and Ugg were on this call earlier, but they had another meeting, so they had to go. But just so you know, they were here.
You see, I'm older. I can stay up later. So it feels like the deck is stacked somewhere. I don't know who is they, but it feels like there's been a lot of polarization, and it makes it feel like you just as you learn the rules, they're changed. For example, just as I learned about liberals and what liberals meant, and for years I was a liberal, and now they changed the name to progressive. And I looked up the definition, and liberal means that you're open to other people's ideas. Progressive means it's a bright, shiny new term, and you even get a new color. Now you're called blue because in the Smithsonian article, it said, who wants to be red? We all knew that red, you'd rather be red than dead in the 50s. Okay. So liberals now are called progressives because progressives don't have to listen to other people. They can just push their agenda through. So the rules seem to be changing faster than we can even wrap our minds around them. And
I hear you, Audrey. I think we do actually. You do have a question already on the table.
Yeah. So let's go back to that. I mean, that question. I think where you were starting is a really good one, and it's the sense of like, is there real learning, right? Is there change here, or is it just simply a moment in which you would have, maybe I won't say more. John, Katie, would you have a response to that?
Oh. Sure, there's definitely learning. I mean, there's definitely learning. There's definitely changing. People. I'll say this and then I'll say something else. We do see people change. The first example that we talked about, the mandatory minimum sentencing, it was a very popular law. It polled 60-30. Our panelists came out strongly against it because it was a bad law that would have bad consequences. So we do see changes like that, particularly like when the evidence becomes overwhelming, when it becomes clear that this is a bad law, right? We do see people shift because they have devoted a lot of time to thinking through this issue, right? And it's a process that your job is to listen and learn, and it is drilled into your head over and over and over again, and you're learning a new way to communicate. And part of the problem is that we aren't necessarily, that's not how we're taught to talk about politics, right? We're taught to win a political conversation. We're not taught to learn and to listen. And I think even when we start talking about like liberals are this way, progressives are this way, right? We're starting to talk about like whoever we think that they are, right? We're not actually talking about people at this point. And one of the beautiful things about deliberation is you are talking directly to someone who might disagree with you, who might have a different experience than you. And it's a lot harder to stereotype them and to dismiss them when you're having a conversation face to face. You know, the work on political persuasion that's coming out now really shows that the way that you change people's mind is by listening to them, by asking them questions and sharing stories about your own experiences, right? It's not focused on winning, it's focused on, I want to understand what your goal is. I want to understand why you feel that way. And then I'll tell you why I feel this way about my experiences that led me to this thing. And then we'll start to figure out, where are their commonalities? Where are their differences? It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to come to the middle. And I think that that's one of the common misperceptions about deliberation, is that you always are going to be coming to the middle. That's not the case at all. You might have a conversation like mandatory minimum and realizing like everybody's a lot more extreme than when they started, and they're extreme in an unpredictable direction, right? But it's about like learning and understanding, and deliberation is really about learning from other people and listening to other perspectives and other experiences and asking questions, right? And having that one-on-one interaction with somebody that you wouldn't have had a conversation with otherwise. So I think that there's so much of our political narrative right now is stereotyping someone that you're never going to actually talk to, right? And you're not doing anything except for shouting into the wind at that point. If you really want someone to change their mind, then you're going to listen to them and you're going to ask them questions.
So Audrey, part of the reason we're so freaked out about Facebook and these echo chambers and so on, and I do recommend the Social Dilemma Network documentary on Netflix if you really want to get spooked. But you know, and that all that's true. And you know, Katie and I don't want to look naive up here, like, hey, everyone should be hopeful. Everything's going great. That's not at all what we're saying. And I think you guys are hearing that. I appreciate that we're still, you know, 68 strong here, you know, 90 minutes into this college class. The point is that under the right circumstances, deliberation works. And what Katie kept saying, and I just want to underscore, is you want a diverse group. I mean, these processes are stratified random samples. They're almost always paid random samples. That is, we want a good response rate. We want to really get to people who would normally say, that's not my thing, right? Well, here's $400 and a, you know, free hotel for 3 nights. How does that sound? Well, that sounds great. I'm in, right? And so you get this really diverse group of people. And, you know, you've probably heard about group polarization, right? Groups go extreme, right? The point of those experiments is you get people together who are all the same, and yeah, they kind of try to outdo each other, right? You know, the liberal says, I'm really progressive, and off they go, right? The whole point is that doesn't work here, right? You saw the slide that Katie showed where actually across the political divide, people clustered together on that issue because they all heard the same evidence and all were in learning mode the whole time. So my point is that these facts can exist simultaneously, that yes, we are polarizing in our society. It's not just elites now, the public is doing it too. And it's partly affective, right? It's emotional. And those same people that those facts are true for can be brought together under the right circumstances and do a fantastic job of deliberating together. They still know how.
Yeah. I'm watching our clock, and so we're very close to taking, I'm actually going to take a little liberty. I know Bob, Ted, I know you've got a hand. We've got one other question, and Bob. Bob, can you ask a question in a very pithy 30-second sort of way? You're not going to do it without unmuting, though.
Sometimes using the space bar works to unmute.
Yes, it does. Sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, right. So I'll try to be brief. I live in Massachusetts. I've not been involved or aware of CIR, but as I'm here, is there any update you could give us to where Massachusetts is in this process?
Yeah, essentially, you know, everything's shut down as far as, you know, legislative priorities and so on goes. I'll post a link. There is an organization in Massachusetts that is on top of this. John Hecht is the state rep who's championed this. Yeah, so it's basically on hold. But I'll tell you a detail. The reason the Massachusetts bill is so important is a fun fact. Oregon didn't fund the CIR. The CIR miraculously was established during the recession. right? If you think about 2009, 2010, right? Governments had no money. They were cutting programs. That last thing they would do is create a new funded commission. Even creating a commission made some people nervous. And that's why some of the Republican votes were against it. No, it had to be funded by nonprofits, and it had been until 2018. There wasn't money. So they just ran a little pilot, you know, with the organization Healthy Democracy, but they couldn't run a statewide CIR. So Massachusetts would be using general funds, and that would be a big step forward. Now, you know, when my European colleagues came over and said, hey, we want to do this in Switzerland or Finland, and they're looking at it, and it didn't take them long to say, hey, who pays for it? And we're like, oh, well, blah, blah. And they're like, what, are you people crazy? Right? Why wouldn't the government pay for this, right? I mean, it's oh, geez. And then it's like, it's America, baby. We're different, right? You know, anyway, so there you go. Fun fact. I'll put a link in the chat.
No, that's great. And the Healthy Democracy, which we haven't, I don't think said much by name earlier, is really kind of behind a lot of this, which is great to note. Luke Phillips, you've been waiting diligently, even though your hand hasn't been up. So I know you've got a quick pithy question. I hear Tocqueville's coming in here somewhere.
He is, yes. So thank you, professors, for this. I got in late, but I get the sense from what I've heard so far that the initiative that you're discussing relies in various ways on both good and ingenious institutional design, and also on inculcating proper habits for citizens of a free democracy. In various ways, those are the two poles of great American political thought, from Tocqueville talking about the habits of democracy on the one hand, and Publius in the Federalist Papers talking about the importance of institutional design on the other hand. With this initiative you're discussing here, and I look forward to looking more deeply into it, which does it lean on more if you have to select one for it to lean on more? Are we only as good as our institutions, or are we only as good as our virtues as a people based on the stuff that you're working on here?
Okay, Katie, secret ballot, and Tim too. I'm not going to say my answer until you both have your answers ready. Is it institutions or civil society, or political society, Tocqueville might say? You ready? Let's hear your votes.
Do we have a hand signal here?
No, just say it.
I'm an institutionalist, I think, if I'm going to go one way or the other.
And Tim, I take it you're going to give your answer, which is wrong?
Yeah, I guess so.
And yes, I am also on the institutional side. It is a 2-to-1 vote, and even with a supermajority rule, which is a reasonable institutional innovation, Tim is incorrect by law. So institutions are more important, and there we have it, folks. Good night, everybody. No, seriously, I love the question. And I'm actually going to plug an older book of mine, The Jury and Democracy, where we talk at length about Tocqueville, because Tocqueville claimed that the jury is this powerful educational institution, and he had about as much evidence as you would expect a college student who went on a road trip in a foreign country for a year, which is to say very little evidence. People believed this. The Supreme Court cited him centuries later, like, hey, this is true. And we wondered if it was, and so we studied the hell out of it for 10 years, because that was an existing deliberative institution. We wanted to see if it was actually changing people. Happy conclusion is, actually serving on a jury and deliberating on a jury does make you a more engaged citizen. It makes you more likely to vote in the future and so on. Super interesting. But it's a great case of the institution itself, right, is so important. And so the decline of the jury system in the United States has this unappreciated kind of effect on draining the civic reservoir. Discrimination in who gets on juries, right, in voir dire has this weird effect of making one part of society more civically engaged than the other. So all kinds of interesting things to think about because of institutions.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Katie.
Tim.
No, please.
No, it's fine.
You're the real speaker. I'm just
no,
making it happen.
I mean, yeah, I think we are so defined and constrained by the institutions in which we interact, and at the same time, our institutions are beholden to the decisions that we make within them. So it's hard to make a decision between those two things, but I think about institutions writ large. Like, Are we giving people adequate opportunities for education? Are we giving people adequate opportunities to have their voices heard? If we don't build up those opportunities, then we can't kind of just expect people to do it on their own. And I think that that's one of the things that we're seeing, like John just alluded to with the jury, right? Is that we've taken civic education out of schools. We've, expanded our understanding of politics has shifted to something that other people do instead of an institution in which we operate, right? And I think that the less we're kind of embedded in these structures that give us the tools and the mechanisms to learn, to express our voice, to make effective decisions, the harder it's going to be for us to even understand what it is we're supposed to be doing in the first place.
Yeah, and maybe as I'm watching the clock as a bit of a response to this and kind of a wrap of sorts, I will say in my defense, John, 3.5 years ago, I wrote an article called "Institutions Supporting Democratic Communication Among Citizens," which I strongly support the role of the institution. So I'm not totally wrong. I'm not going to put that in the chat box just for all the reasons that are obvious. But
there are no obvious reasons why that's not going in the chat box. Everything else is going there.
That's true. Maybe it will.
It's I don't know. It's like that basket in your kitchen where you have the keys and your wallet and 40 other things, which is why you can't find your keys.
That is, yes, that is. So our chat box tonight is a bit of a basket, which has been great. And so hopefully those resources have been potentially helpful to people who, as someone was noting earlier, this was the first time they've actually heard the phrase deliberative democracy be said. So I just want to say to both John and to Katie, thank you very much for the presentation tonight. Really appreciate. Here they come. And in many ways, I think for us, one of the takeaways, as much as I'm familiar with this immediate work and the book and the work more generally, is that this really is one of those hopeful moments that we can look at these experiences that are continuing to happen, right? They're not just a one-off event, but in places that have institutionalized this, there is this continued hope, I think, of seeing the possibility of citizens' voices shaping the larger decisions that are being made. As we were commenting somewhat jokingly there at the end, the institutions matter, and the way that we interact with them and play a part in shaping what's happening through them is a hugely important thing to do. A moment ago, put the link into the chat box for that book. Again, A Hope for Democracy. So I would encourage you to find it as you're able to in whatever platform. And again, there's an Audible version with a great narrator, apparently. I have not listened. But what I want to just say here for a moment, if you haven't been part of these America's public forums in the past, these conversations we will continue between NICD and Braver Angels, bringing these in kind of topical ways. They will be documented on YouTube, on the Braver Angels channel, as well as on any NICD's kind of duplicative. So you can find it. And as the question earlier about the presentation, it will be made available. So some of those fantastic slides will be available to you. Luke, if you want to just say a quick pitch here in just a moment after I say a word about NICD. If you haven't become aware of NICD, the National Institute for Civil Discourse is an organization doing a lot of work, some which we mentioned tonight with state legislators through Next Generation, but also efforts through faith communities like Golden Rule 2020, as well as Engaging Differences. A lot of opportunities that might be really complementary to a number of you who are part of Braver Angels. And if you're not connected with either of those organizations, I would really encourage you to take a look at those. And then Luke, if you want to just say a word here about BA, and then we'll conclude.
Sure thing. Well, thanks, Tim, for hosting a great event. Thank you, speakers, for doing this. I'm doing it. And thank you, Dennis and Ibrahim, for being great support staff here on this front. So Braver Angels, as many of you know, is the nation's largest, fully bipartisan, primarily grassroots-led organization dedicated to bringing Americans together across the red-blue divide and across so many other divides. With the election coming up on us very shortly here, we are working on a lot of different projects, and we invite you to join us. You see the link for joining Braver Angels there. In particular, there's a project that we're doing called With Malice Toward None, which is post-election kind of peacemaking stuff that we would love to work with all of you on. From our community to yours, let's make a better America and build a house united. Thank you again, Tim, for hosting this.
Great. And so we will again, have this available later for viewing. And there was a question about contact information. We'll put that. I don't have the fast fingers right now, so if John and or Katie want to throw in your pages or things to where people could take a look at some of those other books, for example, and other projects and things that you're working on, would be really fantastic. Thanks so much to John and Katie for the presentation and for the conversation, and to everybody who was on the call. You really brought some fantastic questions and hopefully some considerable food for thought. So until the next time, thanks so much for being part of America's Public Forum.